Sean Diddy Combs has just filed a brand new bid to get out of jail before his sentencing in a few months. From arguing he shouldn't be locked up for his swinger lifestyle, to highlighting the atrocious conditions at the MDC, to addressing allegations of violence, he is fighting for his life in this new letter to the judge. Could it work?
It was supposed to be another chapter in the saga of a man who had always come out on top. The mogul, the boss, the self-made icon who turned every accusation into noise and every scandal into clout.
Will Sean Diddy Combs be released from jail? I know I've asked that question before so many different times here on Sidebar, but we have right now a brand new request from his legal team, a brand new filing from his defense team arguing for why he should be released now after that monumental verdict in his criminal case several weeks ago. The circumstances have changed. And I will tell you what, we did an interview a few weeks back that kind of previewed why and how Combs could be released. It was a bail bondsman that is apparently working with Diddy's team behind the scenes. I'm going to get to that a little bit later. But what I want to talk about right now is this latest letter from the defense to the judge overseeing this case, Judge Arun Subramanian. Remember, this comes after a jury of Combs' peers found him not guilty of racketeering conspiracy, not guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking, but they did convict him of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. He's set to be sentenced on October 3rd. Technically, he could face up to 10 years in prison on each charge. Highly unlikely. I think maybe you might be looking at somewhere to 2 to 5 years potentially, but he could also get time served and be released, although that also seems unlikely. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But initially, after the verdict, right after the verdict, his defense team petitioned the court that he should be released. He was just acquitted of some very serious charges. The judge denied it. The judge denied Combs bail once again. And remember, this comes after he was rejected bail multiple times since he was arrested back in September of 2024, highlighting the severity of the charges, the violence, and so forth. But now, this is different. Now, what is the defense arguing? I'm going to go over all this in the new letter. I'm going to give my take at the end about whether or not it's going to be successful and whether or not he will actually be released before sentencing in October. So, the defense begins by arguing that Sean Combs should be released in advance of sentencing, and the court has the power to do this. They have the authority, among other things, because you can clearly show, quote, that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. So, what are those exceptions? What are those reasons? What are those circumstances that are exceptional? They highlight several things that we're going to get into. That the charges he was convicted of, we're going to call them the Mann Act violations, that's what it's called under the law. They're not as severe, they're not as egregious as other convictions in other cases. That the sheer fact that he's locked up at the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, for the past 11 months, that in and of itself is a reason for him to be released. These are all exceptional circumstances, and I'm going to get into all the arguments. But first, they highlight the standard. And they argue that to be released under federal law, you need to show 2 conditions. First, the district court must find by clear and convincing evidence that the person is not likely to flee or pose a danger to the safety of any other person or the community if released. Second, it must be clearly shown that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. Now, clear and convincing evidence is a lower standard. By the way, it's not like beyond a reasonable doubt. Anyway, basically, you have to show he's not a flight risk, he's not a danger, and you have to show there are particular, exceptional, unique reasons for why detaining Combs is wrong. We're going to start with the exceptional reasons justifying his release. And they begin by trying to define, well, what exactly is exceptional circumstances? What does that mean? And they argue that case law suggests a court has a lot of discretion to determine whether a particular set of circumstances qualifies as exceptions. And they say, look, Sean Combs, his case, so different from other ones. There has never been, according to them, a Mann Act prosecution like this one before. And this is how they lay it out. Quote, there has literally never been a case like this one, where a person and his girlfriend arrange for adult men to have consensual sexual relations with the adult long-term girlfriend as part of a demonstrated swingers lifestyle and has been prosecuted and incarcerated under the Mann Act. Combs and 2 of his longtime girlfriends had a private, intimate life that is not uncommon today. They're talking about Jane and Cassie Ventura. Quote,
but this time, the stage was different. This wasn't a red carpet. This was a courtroom. And the crowd wasn't there to cheer. They were there to witness the fall. When the word guilty was finally spoken, the air cracked open. It wasn't just a verdict. It was a rupture, a dismantling, a thunderclap that sent a shiver down the spine of the entire industry. And there, at the epicenter, stood Sean Diddy Combs, frozen, then fuming. He didn't flinch. He didn't breathe. And then, without warning, he snapped to life. "I demand to be released, immediately," he roared, voice echoing off the courtroom walls like a man trying to drown out fate itself. The gallery gasped. Court officers straightened. Reporters raised their phones in a single silent wave. And Diddy? He was just getting started. "This is wrong. This is personal. You think this is justice? This is revenge," he bellowed, eyes blazing, hands clenched so tight the veins showed like cracks in the illusion of control.
Including what they called freak-offs. Jane and Sean Combs had threesomes too. When Jane and Combs watched pornography together, Jane testified that she contacted two different porn stars and invited them to join her and Mr. Combs. Both Miss Ventura and Jane testified that very often they would see the same men over and over again for years. In July of 2024, Jane testified, for instance, that she suggested to Mr. Combs that they call Paul. Jane explained that she told Combs she, quote, missed Paul. When asked why she said that, she responded, "Because I did." This was a lifestyle, one that both Miss Ventura and Jane chose, one they all, as grown adults, had a right to choose. Like many aspects of sex and intimacy, it was not without its complications, its bouts of jealousy, and at times, its frustrations. But that is a hallmark of any serious romantic relationship, and that is what these were, serious, long-term romantic relationships. By the way, not surprising they're really focusing on this because, again, he was acquitted of sex trafficking. They highlight how the jury didn't find sex trafficking of Jane or Cassie, that it didn't occur. There was no force, fraud, or coercion that was used to induce these women to engage in commercial sex acts. For transportation to engage in prostitution, what he was convicted of, the prosecution didn't have to prove that violence was used or that fraud was used or threats were used. It was just, did you transport these women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts? And obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution, payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger, or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, the White Slave Traffic Act has been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. That Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California, two of the three locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that said,
His lawyers rushed to calm him, but it was like trying to wrestle a storm. He shoved one arm away, eyes locked on the judge like the power dynamic hadn't shifted. Like he still believed that the gavel bowed to the brand. "You people don't know what you're doing," he snapped. "You're destroying a legacy. Do you hear me? I am a movement. I built this entire culture." But no one answered. No one bowed. No one moved to save him. Because this wasn't about a brand anymore. This was about accountability. The prosecution stood quietly, then stepped forward without raising their voice. Your Honor, we ask for immediate remand into custody. The defendant has shown a total disregard for this court's authority and has made it clear he does not intend to comply with the judgment. He is not entitled to freedom after this verdict. The judge didn't blink. Motion granted. And just like that, the man who had spent decades weaving a myth around himself was reduced to what he really was. A man in denial, facing the wreckage of what he'd done. Court officers moved in, slowly, carefully, but with purpose. Diddy stepped back, shaking his head, like he could stop it with disbelief alone. Number, you don't get to do this. You don't get to make me disappear. But they did. And they were. The cuffs came out. His wrists were pulled behind his back. Click. Click. It was over. Not the legal battle, not the appeal process, but the illusion, the shield, the arrogance that he could walk through the fire untouched. He didn't say another word as he was led out. The gallery stayed silent, some stunned, others vindicated. One survivor, who had sat frozen throughout the trial, quietly wiped a tear.
As, quote, as a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case.
Another stared straight ahead, unmoved, almost defiant. Because for them, this wasn't a show. It was survival. Outside the courtroom, chaos erupted. Reporters sprinted down marble hallways, phones pressed to ears, shouting into cameras. News vans lined the block. Social media detonated in real time. Diddy remanded after explosive outburst. Courtroom chaos as Diddy demands release. Justice served, Combs taken into custody. The headlines didn't need spin. The footage wrote itself. And in the hours that followed, the desperation only grew. His legal team scrambled to file an emergency motion, a Hail Mary attempt to secure bail before the sentencing phase. They argued that he wasn't a flight risk, that his business interests and family obligations guaranteed he would comply. They painted him as a man under emotional duress, caught in the emotional aftershock of a shocking verdict. But the court had already seen through the act. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. This was a man who had never heard the word no before, finally being told it with a gavel. Still, the motion was filed. They begged for house arrest, electronic monitoring, restrictive bail conditions, anything to keep him out of a cell. And behind closed doors, Diddy was still trying to spin, still trying to control the narrative. He issued a statement through his representative. Not an apology, not a reflection, but a defiant declaration that he would fight this to the end, and that the truth would come out. But the world had already heard enough.
But the jury didn't believe that they were forced to stay in this relationship, right? The jury essentially said they were getting plenty out of this relationship, and that's why we're not going to convict him.
Look, the bottom line is they didn't convict him
You guys
of
are arguing the wrong
violence.
point. The Mann Act, under the bail statute, you can argue what you think the law should be. Here's what the law is. Under the bail statute, it is considered a violent crime. We can say it doesn't include violent. The Mann Act, 18 U.S.C. 2421, prohibits the transportation of individuals across state lines for
Drop a code
constitutional
on
and other immoral purposes. This is called a crime of violence when determining whether to detain a defendant on bail.
Right, on bail.
Counsel, wait a second. He just dropped
That's
code
what we're
on you.
talking
He
about.
had the
That's what
actual.
he's asking for bail.
Hold on.
But the judge didn't allow bail for $1 million.
I know.
They were willing to put $1 million up. And by the way, you know as well as I know that and I'm not defending Diddy here. All I'm saying is, no, I'm not. No, I mean, Diddy should have been convicted in California.
hold on.
But what I'm saying is, you know the Mann Act is not a violent crime.
I know what you're saying. I get it.
It's not.
But the judge has to go by
and
the
because-
code.
So is,
right?
is this
And
about
the
amount?
US
Is this
criminal
about amount?
It's not about amount. So
It says on
once
bail.
Once
It says
the,
on
once
bail.
the violent crime, the defendant, the convicted defendant, has to prove by a preponderance of the evidence or convince the judge one of two things. Either, both, he's not a flight risk. The judge did not weigh not letting him out on him being a flight risk. There's no real evidence he's a flight risk, and that's what the money would go to. Is he willing to leave $50 million behind? He has an ankle monitor.
Right.
He's not really a flight risk.
Surrenders passport, too.
Surrenders passport. The other thing that Diddy has to show, the burden is on Diddy, is that he is not likely to commit the same violent act, the Mann Act, again. Diddy, remember, even though he knew he was under federal surveillance, even though he was about to be arrested, was conducting a freak-off.
So what you're saying is they will keep him behind bars pending sentencing because they're afraid he might have a freak-off with a prostitute.
Correct. He might traffic in prostitutes.
Actually,
right.
And they hold him
judge-
without bail. There are people who kill people who get out on bail. Again, I'm just saying what's right is right. And there are people who kill people who get out on bail after they are convicted.
Are you convinced that Diddy will not engage in a freak-off? I think he probably would.
Can I just say, if there's a freak-off.
The statement backfired. Instead of rallying support, it triggered fury. Survivors who had testified under oath called it a slap in the face. Legal experts dismissed it as pure ego. Even former industry allies stayed quiet. And the silence was louder than any defense. Diddy was learning the hard way that the spotlight doesn't protect you once it turns against you. The same stage he once dominated had become a platform for his downfall. Meanwhile, back inside the facility, his world had shrunk to 4 walls and a narrow window. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't eating. According to sources close to the jail, he was pacing for hours, talking to himself, refusing to make eye contact with guards, demanding privileges that simply didn't exist. He asked for his own cell. Denied. He asked for private calls. Denied. He asked for filtered water, organic food, and a television. Denied. Because this wasn't his world anymore. This was reality. And reality doesn't care who you are. On day 2 of confinement, a new motion was submitted by his team, this time with added urgency. They claimed he was suffering from extreme psychological distress and that continued incarceration posed a health risk. They cited his influence, his philanthropic efforts, his decades-long record of community leadership. But the court didn't bite, because the court had something stronger than PR buzzwords. It had evidence. The judge responded with a single-sentence ruling. Motion denied. And just like that, Diddy's team was out of moves. Again. Still, he kept pushing. In the holding area, he demanded contact with his label executives. He told anyone who would listen that he had albums in the pipeline, projects in development, artists depending on him. "I'm the industry," he allegedly muttered to one officer. "You don't bury the culture like this." But he was wrong, because culture had already moved on. The streets weren't mourning him. The industry wasn't lining up to save him. The fans, they were split. Some still clung to nostalgia, but most were watching the mask fall and realizing it had been a disguise all along. A new survivor came forward that same week. Different city, same story. The same manipulation, the same intimidation, the same violence cloaked in wealth and mystique. Suddenly, the courtroom drama became something darker, bigger. This wasn't just a man on trial. This was a legacy on fire. And he couldn't stop the flames. His team tried one more play, filing for emergency reconsideration based on changing circumstances, arguing that media pressure was putting his safety at risk behind bars. But the prosecution hit back instantly. Mr. Combs created the spectacle. He weaponized his fame for decades to shield himself from accountability. He is not entitled to special treatment because his tactics no longer work. The judge agreed. Another motion? Denied. And just like that, the pattern was undeniable. The more he demanded freedom, the clearer it became that he didn't understand what was happening. He still thought this was about headlines, reputation, optics. But the court wasn't interested in optics. It was interested in justice. And justice doesn't care how many hit records you've sold. In the background, music platforms began quietly removing his image from curated lists. Brand partners issued statements distancing themselves. A documentary series in pre-production was put on indefinite hold. The fallout was seismic, but none of it shook Diddy as much as what came next. Because while he fought to get out, another voice came forward to keep him in. An industry insider, once an ally, now a whistleblower. And their statement, submitted directly to the court under seal, changed everything.